We'll make sure that all this information is available for those listening. A question that seems to be getting a lot of attention in recent conversations publicly is the safety of cultivated meat. Can you talk a little bit about how safety is determined? What are the core regulatory pathways and safety considerations? And where do you see opportunities for improvement and progress?
Yeah, safety is really evaluated like any other foodstuff. And essentially how that process works. So there's been protocols and guidelines developed over decades of how to evaluate safety of food. But at a high level, essentially it works by identifying potential hazards. So what are you putting into the food? What about the process could potentially lead to a downstream hazard to the consumer? Then there's steps that are taken to mitigate those hazards. So how do we prevent those bad things from entering the system, whether it's like a piece of hair or a piece of metal falling into the food, or it's a bacteria or a fungus, stuff like that. And then finally, there's testing that you can perform to ensure the safety aspects of your food for depending on what you're evaluating. So I actually participated in an expert panel that was put together by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in Singapore in late 2022. And that was all about food safety aspects of cultivated meat. And the conclusion there, which is available in a lengthy public report, is that really there's nothing unique about cultivated meat that makes it more challenging to evaluate compared to other types of food, whether that's conventional meat or other like fermentation derived foods like yogurts and things like that. So from a food safety perspective, there's not anything that's, oh, we don't know what to do here. The challenge right now instead is basically that different companies use different inputs. So different inputs into the cell culture media that the cells consume, and also different processes overall for manufacturing. And those processes tend to be unique to the food system, not necessarily unique to like medicine or pharmaceutical world. A lot of that technology is borrowed and translated into the cultivated meat industry. But nevertheless, you have regulators that are coming across something that's new and they need to learn about it. And the way that they learn about it is by talking to companies and also evaluating the sort of safety dossiers that they put together. That basically, once you've gotten your production process up to a point where you're ready to sell to a consumer, and you put together all of the relevant information that a regulator would need to know in order to basically establish that this is going to be a safe production process. So the challenge right now is that regulators don't know exactly what questions to ask and how to do the full evaluation. We have novel foods frameworks in a lot of countries that cultivated meat can fit into, but it often has to be tweaked a little bit. And this is happening in places like South Korea, which just formalized their framework. Japan, Thailand, the UK, these are all countries that are adapting their existing, what we call regulatory framework to fit cultivated meat so that they're ready to receive applications. And then every application, because everything's so new, it has to be independently evaluated. So there's no like single size fits all approach. And so you have countries like Singapore and the United States right now that actually have a long line of applications for products that are waiting to be approved at this point. And you have staffing issues that could be bottlenecks because in addition to cultivated meat, there's other novel foods that people are developing that also need to be evaluated. In the UK, they famously deal with an inundation of products that contain CBD, like hundreds of them are just waiting in line to be approved. And so it becomes difficult to get these products approved in a timely manner. So how can that be alleviated? I think, first of all, education is really important. So what the FAO has been organizing is in different countries, you bring in producers of cultivated meat or other fermentation derived products. You have them meet directly with the regulators and learn, how are you doing this? What are you making? What is the manufacturing process look like? Because otherwise, as we talked about, there's not a lot of information in the existing public literature. And that information that is out there doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's produced in the real world. Like these are just labs that are making cells and evaluating them. It looks a lot different in a commercial USDA regulated facility. And so you really need to have the companies talking to the regulators and educating them. And this is happening all over the world right now. There's also discussions around, can we whitelist certain common media ingredients? So just things like glucose and amino acids, things that we know are safe nutrients, but manufacturers and suppliers need to get those sort of approved themselves from a regulatory perspective. And then the manufacturers of cultivated meat can then go buy those reagents and basically say, look, I've got amino acids from supplier X. You've already approved this happening in this facility that's regulated. And then you could decrease the complexity and amount of time that it's going to take to conduct the evaluation. So that's the current state of things. Different countries are in different stages, let's say, of evaluation and readiness for approving these products. Just to summarize, I think where we're at today, as I mentioned before, we have 3 countries that have approved products. We have Singapore, the United States, and Israel. We do expect more approvals in 2024, especially in the United States and Singapore. There's also products that are under evaluation in Switzerland and the UK and Australia and New Zealand, and likely in South Korea later this year as well. And as I mentioned, the US in particular, when those products are approved, they're highly useful because you get hundreds of pages of information that is released alongside of those approvals. That's not the case in every country, like Singapore, for instance. There's different levels of opaqueness to the approval process and everything. Obviously, from a transparency perspective, I think it's better to have that information out there so people can evaluate it themselves. But we'll see how that looks several years from now as countries are constantly shifting how they're looking at this.
Thank you for giving that broader global perspective and then honing in on some of these particular, very timely examples. Just to make sure our listeners understand how timely this conversation is, can you walk through some of the really important 2023 regulatory breakthroughs and how those are connecting to what you're anticipating in terms of the next steps and in 2024?
Sure. So in 2023, those were the first approvals in the United States. And that was for 2 chicken products produced by 2 separate companies. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of information that was attached to those approvals, which was really important for other companies as well to basically know, oh, this is what I should be putting in my dossier that I'm putting together for the regulator. So just to back up to in the United States, the FDA regulates basically the production of cultivated meat. So the biopsy, from the point of the biopsy up until the point of harvest, at which point it's turned over to the USDA. And that's for meat and poultry products. For seafood in the United States, that's regulated solely by the FDA. And so there's different sort of regulatory oversight and agencies involved in this process. But the facilities that, for instance, chicken and beef and pork will be manufactured in are USDA inspected facilities, just as they are with conventional meat. It's basically treated just the same by the USDA when it's being manufactured. And so all of those things have happened for the first time in 2023. And so I think there's a lot of learnings, not only for other companies to pick up on, but also from the regulators themselves. You actually have people now in these facilities that are overseeing the production of these products, even though it's at very small scale right now. But they're learning more about how this actually works and how it looks. The USDA is anticipated leading into this year to announce guidance on labeling, which is an important issue that from a consumer perspective, people need to know what this is, how it's different. But there's been all different types of terminologies that have been proposed for cultivated meat, which is what GFI has been calling it. But the USDA and some of the dossiers thus far called it cell cultivated. Having that word cell in there seems to be able to maybe help consumers distinguish the difference between this and conventional meat. However, it's also confusing because everything's made of cells anyway. So there's really there's no great single one size fits all. And I think that will continue to evolve, but other countries around the world are also looking. I think this is important. A lot of countries around the world look to the United States FDA and see what they do. And then once it's, the FDA has approved this, we better get going on our own internal sort of frameworks here. And so that speeds up global regulatory processes as well. The FDA has done a lot of education for other agencies around the world that don't necessarily have the resources to think about these new technologies. Places like Brazil, for instance, other like South American countries in Africa. These places don't necessarily have all of the necessary, there's not as many companies there that they can talk to, and they don't have as many resources that we do in the United States. And these things are all additively important for accelerating the frameworks around the world and the understanding of how to evaluate safety around the world. for the different types of cultivated meat products that are being produced. And I think that's really just getting going. As I mentioned, there's a lot of products waiting in line. We're waiting still on the first seafood product to be approved. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things that will happen in 2024. But yeah, it's been a little bit slower than what I might have expected, to be honest. I think a lot of companies are a little bit disappointed in the amount of time that it's taking. So that's something to watch out for. On top of the political sensitivity that now exists in states around the United States thinking about actually banning the technology outright, as well as different countries around the world that have proposed legislation to ban not only the production, but also research into the technology, which is just another level of, I think, protectionism and absurd.
Can you say a little more about the bans and how that's being managed at this point?
Yeah, so I think as one of the domino effects of having these products actually enter the marketplace is then you start getting the existing industry more scared, and then they start to fight back. And so I think what you're seeing now in the United States are proposed bans in certain states where not only is production of cultivated meat outlawed and potentially criminal, but also research is being proposed to just be outright banned as well. And that in certain countries in Europe and South America as well. This tends to fall into this sort of, we need to protect our existing industry. We need to keep our tradition. We might be just afraid of technology. So I think there's a growing amount of pushback now for cultivated meat as it becomes more predominant in the marketplace. I say predominant like it's out there. It's funny that there's these like bans going on when these products are barely even on sale anywhere. But nevertheless, that is a current situation that will, I think, continue to play an important part of the evolution of cultivated meat and how fast things can ultimately happen.
Thank you for that context. I know you've talked a little bit about the state of the industry and research. To your point about availability, can you speak a little more to where is cultivated meat today and where do you see this going this year and beyond?
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to understand that the production of cultivated meat around the world today is basically measured in kilograms. So maybe a couple thousand kilograms. And you compare that to the hundreds of millions of tons of conventionally produced meat and seafood. So it's a rounding error to zero right now. And it's also important to understand that the facilities that cultivated meat is produced in, the equipment that you use in terms of the bioreactors, the tanks that these cells grow in, none of that really exists on Earth. Like some of it is used to make vaccines and other pharmaceutical products, but those are high value, high margin products. And so there's very little potential to basically turn those assets into meat production facilities because they're just going to keep producing high value vaccines and drugs. And so that means that all of the infrastructure is basically going to have to be new. And so it's going to take a large amount of capital investment in order to create facilities that can produce thousands of tons of product every year. And then you need thousands of those facilities, just like we have thousands of farms and slaughterhouses. This is something that is going to happen over a long period of time. Obviously, we need it to happen, I think, sooner rather than later. But nevertheless, the technology right now is not certain. Scalability, there's challenges with respect to scalability. We've never grown animal cells at such large scales before. And so from an investment perspective, there's a lot of risk attached to that. And so you need to really de-risk the scale up of this industry. The first person or company that basically proves that you can begin to produce thousands of tons of this product, that's going to be really important. But until that happens, you're going to have a lot of investors that are not ready to throw hundreds of millions of dollars into the pot for something that is not really a guarantee. And again, that's why you need a lot of public support for other, let's say, capital intensive build outs of infrastructure in the renewable energy sector. We have, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in the United States, where that's leading to a large build out of new facilities for batteries and for other renewable energy componentry. in the United States. A lot of those include loan guarantees and tax incentives and all these different sort of ways that we subsidize our existing meat production system. A lot of those things need to be ultimately switched over to these new production systems as well, or at least equalized in terms of the amount of support that is given from the public sector to these new technologies. So if we can't leave it to just the private market to figure this out, you need the public governmental support to provide capital and provide these sort of basically bridging the gap from early stage technology into something that's really commercializable and profitable. And that's in technology development, you refer to that as the valley of death, because a lot of technologies fail in terms of when you're first beginning to scale up, you need a large amount of capital investment. You need a large amount of debt financing, and then you're producing a small amount of product. And so you're going to not be profitable for a while. And so there's a lot of risk attached to that and a lot of uncertainty. And for cultivated meat, there's a lot of what you would call first of a kind facilities that need to be built. But it's, as I mentioned, it's unclear exactly how that's going to go. With nuclear technology development, you have a switch to more small modular nuclear reactors instead of these very large reactors that can cost dozens of billions of dollars and take literally decades or more to produce. So people are saying, this hasn't been working. Let's create these small and modular facilities. But there's a company that just tried to do that. And even they were not able to get the sort of offtake agreement that you would need to finance that facility. And so then they weren't able to build the facility. And there's a lot of risk attached to doing something for the first time, and especially when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of capital that's needed. And so that's something that I think with cultivated meat is necessary to bring the amount of volume into beyond just single restaurants in a couple of cities around the United States into like actual grocery stores or at least high-end retail stores in multiple locations. To summarize, I think your question right now, cultivated meat is basically available in like a couple of restaurants around the world in very low quantities. It's produced at the kilogram scale. There are a couple of companies that are building these first of a kind facilities that I'm talking about that can produce thousands of metric tons of cultivated meat. And we expect those facilities to begin to become operational in 2025, 2026, 2027, and beyond. And so I think that's really where the rubber meets the road with some of the questions that people have around scalability. Can these companies really begin to produce thousands of tons of product in these facilities? That's when you'll know a little bit more about predicting or projecting the growth of this technology and how readily accessible it's going to be. Because in the intervening years, the scale of the production are just so small that only a couple of restaurants can be serviced by a single facility. So that's how it currently stands.
Whenever we think about the challenges, to circle back on, we started the conversation that are connected to sustainability, to what is anticipated in terms of the demand for meat exceeding available land and supply by 2050, the animal welfare concerns and more, the problems can feel daunting. And the pace of progress, as you've mentioned, can feel far too slow. And the place I always try to focus from a positive change management perspective is to think about small changes that we can make that are within our control from a variety of different lenses. So I'd love to kind of wrap up our conversation looking at this from a few different vantage points, as I think many of our listeners are absolutely on board with recognizing the sustainability benefits, the benefits to human health, the benefits to animals and more, and would want to support this. But when we think about current state of things, right, there's much that goes beyond the individual level. But if we start with students, to your point about students helping to drive the conversation with principal investigators and advancing the research, let's start there. What can students do who are inspired by this conversation, who are interested in the work that you're doing? We'll make sure the links to everything you've discussed and more are included. But how can students take what they've heard today, take what they're learning from your website, and put that into positive action?
Yeah, I get emails from students every week at this point, multiple people reaching out. I think there's a lot of students often feel a fear of missing out. They often feel like, oh, this is all happening so fast. And is there going to be opportunity for me in 6 years? Should I do a PhD, or what's going to be on the other side of that? So I think what I tell people is that this is just beginning. There's going to be a lot more opportunities 6 years from now than there are today. I think that much is almost a certainty. I think what's interesting about cultivated meat is that it's so interdisciplinary. I have this background in stem cell biology. I was trained as a neuroscientist, but did a lot of my work in the context of disease modeling for neuromuscular diseases like ALS. And that I learned a lot about cell culture, cells, cell lines, cell culture media. But that's just like one tiny piece of the puzzle in terms of the scientific interdisciplinary world that cultivated meat is. You can have interests. You don't have to be a technical person. We need technical people on the biology side. We need people in biochemistry, in engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, but we need food scientists as well to actually make these products. We need people that are in the social scientists to understand the demand and what sorts of socio-economical changes and implications this technology might have. You need people working on environmental impact analysis to understand what we should be doing from a practice perspective, from an input perspective. All of these different things come together on a policy side of things as well. There's a lot to do. Obviously, you mentioned the need for public support, and that basically is derived from policy changes, both at the federal and your state and local levels. So you can have an impact in a variety of different ways there. And I think, basically what I say in talks that I give, especially to students, is that I think the most important thing from a career perspective is that you're doing something that you are good at, but also that you feel is good for the world. And that from a vocational perspective, you're going to feel fulfilled. And so cultivated meat is interesting because a lot of people come at it from, they might say it's driven by animal welfare or sustainability or human health or just scientific curiosity. But there's all of those worlds that sort of intersect. And you can really align your values with your work and your vocation in cultivated meat. There's a Japanese term called ikigai that summarizes this sort of reason for being. So you can get paid for what you're good at, but also what the world needs, etc. And so I think cultivated meat for a lot of people fits. That's how I got into it and transitioned my career. And I think a lot of students sympathize with that, of wanting to basically do something that has a bigger impact on the world. And to me, there's really nothing bigger and more important than this. That's so multidimensional for different problems that the world is facing. So yeah, pursue your passion. I think that's the takeaway.
I think that the ikigai concept is one that we can all find something that resonates with us, that when we think about how all those pieces come together, we can look at where we're achieving some element of ikigai in our lives and where we want more of that. And I think we continue to hear more and more interest in finding that type of alignment across one's career. So certainly includes students and includes faculty and those working in industry and parents and others with a variety of different areas of focus. When we think about the points you just raised, policy is one that for many people can sound like it's not an area that they can contribute to, when in actuality, at least if I'm taking a US-centric lens for a moment, there are a variety of different ways to share thoughts and perspectives in support of this work and to connect with one's own legislators. Can you speak a little bit to resources GFI offers and or advice you would have for those interested in helping to support from a policy perspective?
Yeah, so I think we have a whole policy team and department at GFI because policy is just one of these important pillars like that you need to happen. Generally, what happens with technology development can only go so far. You really need policy to begin to supercharge that, to get it actually out into the real world. And so the policy that we focus on is mostly to do with getting more public funding into these technologies and also advocating for fair regulation and labeling laws, for instance. So basically, I think what I'm an outside observer into the policy realm. I think what I would say is the most important thing is education. The people that sit in Congress, state or federal Congress, there are very few people that even know what the hell this is. And yet special interests can pass laws that you're going to vote on party lines or whatever it may be. And so the most important thing I think that can begin to deflect that at least is just education. So talking to your family and friends, word of mouth is really important. Writing letters to the people in your state legislatures and things like that. Sharing reliable, robust information is a good way, I think, as a starting point to contribute. Yeah, that seems to be the biggest bottleneck that I observed, but I'm sure some of our other policy people at GFI would have maybe more astute observations of how you can directly contribute.
Thank you for sharing that. I saw you had recently been promoting some open opportunities that people can apply to, including grant funding opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways people can look to engage with you, your work, and GFI directly?
Yes, as I mentioned, GFI we're a nonprofit organization. Everything that we produce is basically open and out there. We have so many resources on our website that people get overwhelmed. I get overwhelmed with tracking all of them now, but definitely encourage people to spend time on the website. As I mentioned, we have a policy team, but we also have a science and technology team that I'm on and also a corporate engagement team. So there's resources that basically are tailored to all these different audiences, whether you're a scientist, whether you're an investor, whether you're a company, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're just a curious individual that's looking to get educated. That's all there. A grant program that you mentioned. Yeah, we just opened our 2024 call for research proposals. And so we have very tailored calls about identifying what's a challenge in the industry and then getting proposals together and funding research that addresses that. So there's 3 opportunities respectively in plant-based meat, in fermentation, and also in cultivated meat. This year, I think applications are open until nearly the end of May. And we fund projects that are about $250,000 up to 2-year long projects. And again, this is supposed to be catalytic research where you can get a substantial amount of work done, but really bring in additional funds to carry that out into the real world. Whether that's spinning out a company or bringing on additional public research dollars to further develop the sort of knowledge base around these research gaps. And I also mentioned we are a network of organizations. We exist in the United States, spread out remotely. There's about, I think, 115 or so of us in the United States now. But we also have teams in Brazil, in Europe, in Israel, in India, and in Asia Pacific region based out of Singapore. And so there's about another at least 100 people around the world that are working on these. And we do at a high level the same thing across all of their affiliate organizations, but a lot of that work becomes tailored into the specific regions and sensitivities of different regions in those places. And yeah, there's a lot of resources in all of those respective websites that you can check out. And there's different focus areas across our organizations. For instance, Europe is just such a politically diverse place. So a lot of the work that our GFI Europe team does is understanding how does Italy think about this compared to France? What's the UK doing? We need people in all of those different areas to advocate, but also understand the sort of climate, political climate and other implications as well. So super interesting. You get a very unique global perspective when you're working at GFI and following our resources. So yeah. For me personally, I try to be a public facing scientist. So I'm active on Twitter. You can find me at Elliot Swartz, just my name with no spaces. On LinkedIn as well, I post specifically more about the resources that we have in the major projects. And I try to post specifically about cultivated meat. So if you're interested in staying up to date on the industry, I'm a good person, I think, to follow.
Fantastic. Anything else you want to add for our listeners that we haven't yet touched on?
Touched on so much. We could talk about this for another 5 hours, I'm sure, but it was great to be on the podcast and we covered a lot of good ground and I really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks so much for sharing your insight. This has been a fascinating discussion.